I'm Margie with Flow Motion Education, and I have a question for you today. Do you know where your hip joint is? Go ahead and point to your hip joint. I can't see you, no one can see you, but go ahead and point to your hip joint, where you think your hip joint is. So I've been teaching movement classes for a couple of decades now, and I often start the class by asking my students where they think their hip joint is. And I would say about 90% of the time, my students either point right here or right here. And in fact, neither of those are actually your hip joint. So what I mean by the joint is where two bones come together, that's what a joint is, and where movement actually occurs. So if you pointed here, you are technically pointing to a spot on your pelvis called right here. It sticks out, so it's easy to find, and technically it's called the anterior superior iliac spine. Yes, that's a mouthful and we don't really care, but that's where you're pointing. You're actually pointing to your pelvic bone. If you pointed here, you're actually a lot closer, but you're probably actually on your femur or thigh bone and not actually in the vicinity. You're close to the hip joint, so you are in the vicinity, but you're not, that is not the hip joint where the movement actually occurs. So I'm going to start by helping you find your hip joint so that when you're doing your exercises that involve the hip joint, you can actually visualize what the bones are doing. The easiest way to find it is you put one finger on this knobby bit that sticks out that we just learned is called the anterior superior iliac spine, not that we care, or ASIS for short, but it's a good landmark. And then a finger on your pubic bone. So there's a bone down there at the bottom. And if you kind of draw a diagonal line between the two and split the difference, you're pretty darn close to the actual joint between the pelvis and the femur or thigh bone where movement is occurring. Now I'm going to show you what the joint actually looks like, and then we'll talk about what movements are available at the joint. So this is a femur, and this is the head of the femur, or the ball. It's a ball and socket joint, so this is the ball. This is a pelvis. And you'll see on the side of the pelvis is the socket that the ball fits into. So it's got a lot of movement available, like a ball and socket. We are going to be talking about the mechanics of your hip joint in what's called a closed chain environment, which is just a fancy way of saying your foot is in contact with the floor. So in most anatomy and kinesiology books, they will describe movement of the hip joint in an open chain environment, which if you're a dancer or playing soccer, or there's all kinds of things, yes, that we do with the hip joint in an open chain environment, but most of what we do with the hip joint is in a closed chain environment. So we're going to be focusing on the hip joint biomechanics with the foot on the floor. So I'm going to show you some movements that involve the hip joint. Now, if I were talking about open chain, again, we'd probably be orienting around the foot. Move your foot forward, move your foot back, out to the side, rotate your foot in, rotate your foot out. All of that is generating motion at the hip joint. But in a closed chain environment, we're going to be orienting more around the pelvis. So if I say, for example, take a step forward, right there, I'm involving the hip joint, and I now have one leg back and one leg forward, and if I go into a lunge, or like a yoga warrior pose, moving into that position, can you see how this hip joint is moving? And in fact, this hip joint is moving. Technically, the angle between my pelvis and my femur is changing. That means there's movement at the joint between the two. What I'm doing, if I were to show you on the skeleton, so the back leg, let's do the back leg. We move the pelvis forward in space as if we're taking a step. We move the pelvis forward and the back leg ends up behind the pelvis. So that is in fact movement at the hip joint. Even though I'm orienting around the pelvis, that movement happened at the hip joint. The front leg, I'll use the same side, the right leg. If I go into this lunge or knee bend in the front, that again, there's movement in other joints, but we're focused on the hip joint. The pelvis lowering and lifting changes the angle between the femur and the pelvis. So again, that is hip joint motion. The socket or the ball rotating in the socket. That's where the movement is happening. If I take my pelvis and I kind of shift it over to the side, so again, I'm going to be doing my right leg. So I move my pelvis to the right. Again, this might surprise you in fact, but that motion is happening at the pelvis. That's where it's or at the hip joint, the junction between the pelvis and the femur. I'm changing the angle between the femur and the pelvis. If I go the other way, that's also motion that's happening at the hip joint. My pelvis is traveling to the right, and that motion is the ball, the head of the femur, rotating in the socket. So that's your little introduction to hip joint biomechanics in a closed chain environment.